loud and clear.
Today we continue our weekly segment dealing with the ongoing militarization of space. As the U.S. continues to withdraw from international arms treaties, will the weaponization and militarization of space bring the world closer to catastrophe? We're joined from Old Westbury, New York by Professor Karl Grossman. He's a full professor of journalism at the State University of New York College at Old Westbury. He's also the author of 6 books and the host of a nationally aired television program focused on environmental, energy, and space issues. And we're joined from Maine by Bruce Gagnon. He's the coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space and a contributor to Foreign Policy in Focus. Welcome back to both of you.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Bruce, let's start with you. One of the things that we've talked about on this show in this segment in previous weeks is the role, this is going to sound crazy to Americans who don't know their history, but the role of Nazis in the development of the U.S. space program, and not just the space program, but the missile program as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I learned about this early on from an incredible book called Secret Agenda by Linda Hunt, a former CNN reporter, where she tells the entire story about the U.S. secret program called Operation Paperclip, that after World War II, 1,500 of the top Nazi military operatives were smuggled into the United States. Even the President of the United States wasn't aware of it at the time that it happened. And amongst these 1,500 Nazi operatives were former head of Nazi intelligence that were brought to help create the CIA, but also there were 100 of the Nazi rocket scientists, Verner von Braun and his engineer team, and they brought along with them 100 copies of the V-2 rocket brought to Huntsville, Alabama, where they created the U.S. space program. And among them was a guy by the name of Major General Walter Dornberger. And Dornberger was the liaison between Hitler and the Nazi rocket team. His job was to oversee the operation. He became vice president of Bell Aerospace in New York.
Wow.
And went on to speak to the Congress of the United States some years later, outlining a proposal to put orbiting battle stations in space. So what we're seeing today, I believe, is the fulfillment of this Nazi prophecy.
Yeah, Operation Paperclip was one of the largest, the broadest, the most extensive early operations in the history of the CIA. It actually began before the CIA was created, and it was run by the OSS. Some of these Nazi scientists later told journalists that as Germany was falling apart in the spring of 1945, they gathered together and they said, so what do? Do we give ourselves up to the Russians or to the Americans? And they unanimously decided to give themselves up to the Americans. Now, some of them had been Nazi Party leaders, not just members of the Nazi Party, but actual leaders of the Nazi Party. And they remained in Germany in hiding. Some of them got to Austria, some of them got to Switzerland and came to the United States later, because this Operation Paperclip dragged on all the way to 1959. You're exactly right that scientists like Verner von Braun and his entire V-2 rocket team found their way to the United States through this program. President Truman didn't even know that we had this program. And they're the guys that ended up designing American missiles in the 1950s through the 1950s, and then rockets in the 1960s that finally enabled us to go to the moon.
And it's important to know that during the war, when they were building these rockets, they did it at a concentration camp called Dora, where camp inmates were starved, beaten, hanged, and literally worked to death as slaves inside a mountain tunnel that they called Middlework. And when the Americans' army liberated this place, they found 6,000 bodies covering the ground, and come to find out well over 20,000 of these slaves at Middlework were killed at the hands of these Nazis. And in fact, I've read in various accounts that Verner von Braun at one time pled with the Nazi operation, the Nazi hierarchy, to send more slaves there so they could speed up the operation. So these are the people that were brought to this country.
This wasn't a secret that von Braun was a Nazi, and it wasn't a secret that he had entered a senior position in the U.S. government at NASA. What was the public reaction when people found out that we had Verner von Braun on the taxpayers' payroll?
He was celebrated. Verner von Braun, in fact, there's a little museum down there in Huntsville, Alabama, celebrating Verner von Braun. I mean, this whole hideous history,
it's incredible,
is really unknown, and I must fault my profession, the press, the media, not really digging it up then, or in fact digging it up now. I mean, Linda Hunt and Bruce and I have met Linda, a great journalist, and she's done this work in books. A very important author too on this phase of a very dark side of American history. Jack Mano, he was a professor, now emeritus at the Environmental Science and Forestry College, as part of the State University of New York. Let me just read this is from my book, Weapons in Space, in which I quote Jack Mano's book, Arming the Heavens. Quote, in 1947, Major General Walter Dornberger, again, this big Nazi military space figure, as a consultant to the U.S. Air Force, an advisor to the Department of Defense, wrote a planning paper for his new employees. He projected a system of hundreds of nuclear-armed satellites, all orbiting at different altitudes and angles, each capable of re-entering the atmosphere on command from Earth to proceed to its target. The Air Force began early work on Dornberger's idea under the acronym NABS, Nuclear-Armed Bombardment Satellites. As a variation on NABS, Dornberger also proposed, and it goes on in Jack Mano's book, and I include it because it's so important in my book. And now many years later, and we're talking about 70 years later, we see this push by the Trump administration for a space force and weaponry in space. And of course, Reagan's Star Wars was all about that too. But the history goes back to this post-World War II era, and Project Paperclip and the Nazi scientists being in the middle of American space military policy and actions.
Yeah, they were celebrated in their time, especially the 1950s and 1960s. I just found something online I want to read to you. It's fascinating to me. A whole host of these Nazi scientists, Kurt Diebes, Eberhard Reiss, Arthur Rudolph, Werner von Braun, Ernst Geisler, a whole bunch of them. They won the NASA Distinguished Service Medal, which is the highest award that can be bestowed by NASA. They won the Department of Defense Distinguished Civilian Service Award, which is the highest civilian service award given by the Department of Defense. They won the Goddard Astronautics Award, highest honor bestowed in the field of astronautics. I'm not sure what that is. They were elected to the U.S. Space Camp Hall of Fame in Huntsville, Alabama. They were elected to the New Mexico Museum of Space History Hall of Fame.
Wait a second, does the N in NASA stand for Nazi? Or?
It might as well. And then this is the funniest one. They all had craters named after them on the moon.
Oh, God. Well,
Nazi craters, brought to you by American taxpayers.
The Global Network has organized a couple conferences and protests in Huntsville over the years. And when we've gone there, people in the community don't really want to talk about these Nazis. They call them the Germans. And what they say is that these Germans actually brought culture to Huntsville, Alabama. Boy. The opera, the ballet, all that kind of stuff.
Well, they were the master race. I mean, of course they'd bring...
They also made the trains run on time.
That was Mussolini.
Oh, that's right. That was the Italians.
Well, and let me add also from Arming the Heavens. Again, this is in my book. My book is titled Weapons in Space. The Nazi scientists are an important historical and technical link, and also an ideological link. Those are Mano's words. He goes on as to the claim of space warfare being defensive, how Reagan characterized his Star Wars plan as a shield to the Appalachian missile defense today. And this is Mano, quote, "It's all a smokescreen. The aim is to put all the pieces together and have the capacity to carry out global warfare, including weapons systems that reside in space. I mean, and here we are with Trump, worse than ever in terms of the weaponization of the heavens, making space into a war zone.
Let's keep on this topic of NASA, too. NASA is going back to nuclear rockets. That's something that they haven't done in a while. Tell us a little bit about that. Bruce, you want to start?
Well, for many, many years, they were working on a thing they called the Death Star, an orbiting laser-powered battle station that would be powered with nuclear reactors. So for a long, long time, the Pentagon has said that they would require ultimately nuclear power in space, nuclear reactors, to generate the kind of force for weaponry in space. So this has been something they've been working on and developing for many, 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 many years.
And it's not just nuclear, which is horrible enough. Nuclear reactors up there above our heads in space on these battle platforms. The scheme has been for years to have nuclear-powered rockets delivering all kind of stuff up to these battle platforms. And they would be, in fact, there was one called Timberwind. This is a few years ago, a nuclear-powered rocket servicing the weapons system in space. And here, let me read. And again, today we're going backwards. In fact, the headline, this is just a few days ago, March 2nd, from The Hill, publication out of Washington, NASA is going back to the future with nuclear rockets. And the first line of the story is tucked into the recent spending bill that was passed by Congress is a line item for $100 million for NASA to develop a nuclear thermal rocket. And here's another piece. This is in Forbes magazine. Nuclear in Space, the NETS meeting. And what NETS stands for is Nuclear and Emerging Technologies for Space. And this is also a recent piece. This is February 28th, about an annual gathering of people from NASA, national laboratories, and so forth, pushing for nuclear-powered rockets in space. And it's all tied up, and there's never been any kind. NASA was created ostensibly as a civilian entity in 1958, but it's never been just a civilian entity. It works hand in hand with the U.S. military. Many of the NASA missions are called dual-use, dual-purpose missions, where certain military requirements are met, along with, but this is often a cover, civilian purposes.
One of the visions of this conference that Carl just referred to that was held in Washington State last month, where the industry, NASA, nuclear industry, NASA, and others came together. They've been holding these conferences annually for many years. I've been to some of them and protested outside of many of them. And they're also talking about nuclear-powered mining colonies on the moon and Mars and various asteroids for mining for rare minerals and resources. And so just imagine a succession of launches of nuclear devices on rockets that have a 10% failure rate from a place like Cape Canaveral. In 1997, NASA launched the Cassini mission with 72 pounds of plutonium-238 on it. And we ran an international campaign for 3 years before that, opposing that launch. And in the environmental impact statement for that particular launch, NASA admitted that if there was a launch explosion and a release of the plutonium as dust, it would be carried by the winds for a 60-mile radius in Florida. So from Cape Canaveral westward to Disney World, north to Daytona Beach, and south to Vero Beach, Florida. And they said that whole area would be radiated. And they would have to go in and remove all the people. They would have to go in and remove all the buildings. They'd have to go in and remove all the vegetation, the animals, imagine that. And then the top half-inch of soil, because everything, again, would be radioactive for thousands of years. And just before that launch, Los Alamos it was reported in a newspaper in New Mexico that Los Alamos Department of Energy laboratory, they had 244 cases of worker contamination as they were fabricating the generators for that Cassini mission. And so DOE has a long history of water and air pollution with radioactive sources. So these missions are actually killing people, these space nuclear missions, even before they're launched.
I want to just ask a follow-up question about that. I mean, given the risk, the catastrophic risk, again, if there was an explosion, 60 square miles of radiation, and having to remove all the people, having to remove property, a lot of people dying, what's the justification? I mean, their justification for having such attendant risk in terms of cost-benefit analysis. Is it just as simple like mistakes won't happen, accidents won't happen, and thus we don't have to sweat it?
Well, it's all kind of wishful thinking to the extreme, and also deceit. For example, I'm looking here at the Forbes story. Solar energy does not work much beyond Mars. That's not true. In fact, it was the Juno space probe, which reached a planet called Jupiter in 2016, 3 years ago, and instead of using nuclear onboard power, it had solar power, solar panels. So if we want to explore space, we can do it safely and not endanger a life on Earth. And if I could just jump back to the Cassini protests, let me jump to the Hill article now about this going back to the future with nuclear rockets. And here's a big chunk of words, very much reflecting on the great work of the global network against weapons and nuclear power in space. It says, NASA would be advised to prepare for protests from the anti-nuclear movement when it launches its flight demonstration of a nuclear thermal rocket, similar to the ones that accompanied the launch of the Cassini probe to Saturn, powered by nuclear-fueled RTGs. And this is what Bruce was talking about in 1997. And then it goes on about safety studies. Here we're talking here about wishful thinking and deceit to ensure the space agency will, of course, conduct safety studies to ensure that the risk of a launch accident is as low as possible. But such studies likely will not deter protest demonstrators or even lawsuits. But they will answer any objections that anti-nuclear activists will offer. They will not, in fact, answer any objections. We're being pushed. We're talking about global disaster. In the environmental impact statement for the Cassini mission, it talks about there was a flyby involved with the Cassini probe, and it's 75 pounds of plutonium were to be sent back at Earth to increase its velocity. And if it missed, the trajectory was off and it hit the atmosphere and that plutonium was dispersed, that EES talks about 5 billion of the Earth's 8 billion inhabitants at the time receiving radiation exposure. I mean, the scale of destruction here is so immense. It's also unnecessary, and again, very, very much tied into weaponizing space, turning the heavens into a war zone.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one of our successes on that Cassini campaign was when they did the flyby, they moved it several hundred miles farther away from the Earth as it swung around the Earth to gain momentum to go out into deep space. So we forced them essentially to change the trajectory of the flyby and move it further away from the Earth, lowering the possibility of a dramatic reentry into Earth orbit and burning up and spreading the plutonium. There have been a number of failures over the years of these kind of space nuclear missions where they burned up on reentry, fell back to Earth, burned up on reentry, and spread plutonium and uranium globally. And Dr. John Goffman, one of the founders of uranium, studied a particular accident in 1964 called SNAP 9A, a U.S. military satellite with 2 pounds of plutonium. And he said he believes it's one of the major reasons for the increases of cancer on the Earth today.
That's amazing. I'm looking at the something called solarsystem.nasa.gov. So this is a government publication about the Cassini project. I want to read a couple sentences just so our broader audience that may not be paying that much attention to it, one, has a little bit more of an understanding and also a little bit better sense of the propaganda coming from the U.S. government about it. Here's what it says. For more than a decade, NASA's Cassini spacecraft shared the wonders of Saturn and its family of icy moons, taking us to astounding worlds where methane rivers run to a methane sea and where jets of ice and gas are blasting material into space from a liquid water ocean that might harbor the ingredients for life. Cassini revealed in great detail the true wonders of Saturn, a giant world ruled by raging storms and delicate harmonies of gravity. Cassini carried a passenger to the Saturn system, the European Huygens probe, the first human-made object to land on a world in the distant outer solar system. And then here's the last paragraph. After 20 years in space, 13 of those years exploring Saturn, Cassini exhausted its fuel supply, and so to protect moons of Saturn that could have conditions suitable for life, Cassini was sent on a daring final mission that would seal its fate. After a series of nearly 24 nail-biting dives between the planet and its icy rings, Cassini plunged into Saturn's atmosphere on September 15, 2017, returning science data to the very end. I want to ask both of you, it sounds wonderful, it sounds daring, it also sounds entirely benign, as if these daring missions that finally ended up plunging into Saturn's atmosphere was more or less risk-free.
Well, it certainly not risk-free from the get-go, from the launch. And also, here is NASA presuming that there is no life. It would be a strange form of life. No life where it's sending Cassini crashing. It's so completely irresponsible. Years ago, they used to sterilize, as I understand it, the U.S. did, stuff that they were sending up into space so that we wouldn't contaminate other heavenly bodies. But to save money, again, this is what I've been told, that has stopped. So here we are, not only endangering life on Earth, but threatening any life that might exist where we're sending these nuclear-powered systems.
Right. Go ahead, Bruce. It sounds, when I read that was the first thing that came to my mind as well. They're crashing this stuff into Saturn.
Well, you might remember from the old television series Star Trek, the original, they had a prime directive that they often talked about on almost every show as they went off into space, came in contact with other life forms or other places where there might be life. And the prime directive was do no harm. And so from the very outset, from the very planning stages, when they sit down at the NASA to make a decision on what kind of power source are they going to use on a particular mission, what we've learned over the years is that the nuclear industry occupies most of the seats on the planning committee. And so the industry views space as a new market. They're desperate to move nuclear power into space. They just see so many possibilities and opportunities for profit. And so they've taken control of all the decision-making processes so that when they could use solar, they don't. They say it won't work. We have to use nuclear. And so they've forced their way. They've broken through and controlled the process to the point where they're now risking the lives of everybody on this planet and possibly risking other life forms in other places that where they deposit these nuclear devices in the future.
We have about 2 minutes left, John. And Bruce and Karl, where do you want to end? What's our last big story here?
I want to say something about Reinhard Gehlen, also part of this Operation Paperclip. Yeah. I think this is one of the biggest stories of all. During the war, Major General Reinhard Gehlen served as Hitler's intelligence chief on the Eastern Front. His Foreign Army's East apparatus relentlessly probed for weaknesses in the Soviet defenses as the Nazi juggernaut made its eastward thrust. He pointed out the location of Jews, communists, and other enemies of the Third Reich. They were ultimately overrun by Hitler forces, so they could be rounded up and executed by death squads. Galen was brought to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip. He was introduced to Allen Dulles. They helped create the CIA together. And then in 1955, he was sent back to the new country, West Germany, the divided Germany after the post-World War II area. So in 1955, he was transferred to the West German government, where he became the head of intelligence for West Germany. So here the U.S. planted one of the top Nazi operatives, intelligence operatives, a known criminal, a known killer, should have been at the Nuremberg war crimes for all that he did. He was deposited in place in West Germany as the new head of intelligence for West Germany. It tells you a lot about what came as after the creation of the West German government, Operation Gladio, where the U.S. and NATO were using these Nazi operatives to interfere in Italian elections and make sure communists wouldn't be elected, and other such moves throughout Europe in the post-World War II era. It's a dirty, dirty story, Operation Paperclip. More people should know about it.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. And again, I don't think we should be naming airports or bridges or tunnels after people who were admirers of the Nazis. And we're here in Washington, D.C., Dulles Airport, named after John Foster Dulles. John Foster and Allen Dulles, who became the head of the CIA, John Foster was Secretary of State, they admired Hitler before the war. Once the war started, they had to kind of cool it. But anyway, extremely important history, basically unknown history, John. I want to thank both of our guests for that.
We were very pleased to have both Karl Grossman and Bruce Gagnon. We were joined from Old Westbury, New York, by Professor Karl Grossman. He's a full professor of journalism at the State University of New York College at Old Westbury. He's also the author of 6 books and the host of a nationally aired television program focused on environmental, energy, and space issues. And we were joined from Maine by Bruce Gagnon. He's the coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, and he's a contributor to Foreign Policy in Focus. Stay tuned to Loud and Clear. We have a lot more coming up.
Loud and Clear.